Hello. So many of us hear about post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Some of us think of it in terms of combat veterans. That's very common. Also, rape victims. But there's more to it than that. And everybody seems to think they know what PTSD is. Some people even say, I have PTSD. We all do have trauma and trauma triggers. We do. We all have them about something. Something upsets us, something gives us reactivity, something sets us off or sets us up to get upset. So, that said, I'm going to use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association criteria to tell you what post traumatic stress disorder is clinically. Now, I'm going to read what they say and then I'm going to put it in layman's terms. So, today, all we're going to do is discover what post traumatic stress disorder is and see if any symptoms apply to you. Now, these criteria can, you may have some of them, you may have none of them, you may have all of them, you might feel like you do, and some of them may be interchangeable. So, in short, it's an anxiety disorder that I say causes emotional flooding and numbing, constantly getting flooded with negative emotions, panic, and then numbing. Now, there's ways that you get it. So we're going to dig into that right now. The way you can get post-traumatic stress disorder, the criteria for that is directly experiencing traumatic events, witnessing things that have occurred to others. So we have to be careful when we watch the news, don't we? Learning these traumatic events occurred to a close family member or close friend. And in cases of actual or threatened death of this family member or friend, the event must have been violent or accidental. Horrific is a better way to put it. And then experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events. This happens to first responders, people who collect human remains, police officers, repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse. And all this exposure through media and television is is not applicable to having PTSD. You can get complex PTSD from living with narcissists and sociopaths and rape victims, as I said earlier too. So that's how you can be diagnosed with PTSD. That's how, and this is not to diagnose you. This is just reading from the diagnostic manual because so many people say, I have PTSD, and they may not. They may have a complex PTSD response, which can happen if you live with a sociopath or a narcissist for a long time. But these are the symptoms. So we're going to go in the presence of one or more of these following intrusive symptoms associated with these traumatic events we read earlier. You'll have recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event. And in children older than 6 years old, repetitive play may have these themes. So you may be experiencing those. Then you may have recurring distressing dreams, nightmares. They don't say nightmares in here, but that's what they are. They're horrible nightmares. People with PTSD have terrible nightmares related to traumatic events. And in children, these can be frightening dreams without any recognizable content. You can also have intense or prolonged psychological distress of exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event, such as, my dad took me on a lot of house calls and not everyone made it. So every time I hear a siren, I have some reactivity. So that's some psychological distress, just a little bit. And I've learned to tamp it down and what to do about it. And we're going to be talking about how to do that in future presentations. Also, you'll have physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the trauma. Now, that means your heart will pound, your hands might shake, you might break out into a sweat, you might have a panic attack. These are physiological, meaning biological and psychological combined, your fight, flight, and frozen mechanisms. There's fight, flight, frozen, and collapse. Some people like to put fawning in there, but that's actually just a trauma response. It's not in the diagnostic manual as part of these triggers. So another way that you can be diagnosed with this, if you have persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event, beginning after the traumatic event, as evidenced by one or more of the following. You will have avoidance of or efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with traumatic events. That means you don't talk about it. We hear a lot of veterans that say they don't talk about it and they don't want to. That's avoiding. And when you avoid, it creates a void. And we will talk about how all these symptoms can be um, neutralized, recognized, and neutralized in later presentations. Also, you can have avoidance of or efforts to avoid external reminders such as people, places, conversations, activities, objects, situations that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with a traumatic event. Okay, that makes sense. You avoid. Now, some of these other symptoms are ones that are they're kind of paradoxical in some ways, and they can be interchangeable. They can occur, like I said, the same person who gets irritable and emotionally flooded and has a panic attack is the same one who may shut down at times. It can mimic bipolar disorder sometimes. So be very careful. This is, again, not to diagnose you, it's just to let you know what the diagnostic codes are and how people might be mistaking that they have PTSD when they actually don't, or they might not notice it if they do, and they need to seek professional help. Other things happen. There have negative alterations in thoughts and moods associated with traumatic events. They get worse after the event. That's what I say time does not heal all wounds. Time can make it worse. That's not in the manual, but I threw that in there. You may have inability to remember an important aspect of the trauma, and you may have dissociative amnesia. And this is not related to anything that might have a head injury or if you were on alcohol or drugs at the time of the trauma. It could be related to that. You also can have persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about yourself, such as the world is bad, no one can be trusted, it's dangerous, my whole nervous system is permanently ruined, I'll never get better, on and on and on and on, just negative, persistent thoughts. You can also have persistent, distorted thoughts about the cause or consequence of the traumatic event that can lead the individual to blame himself or herself or others. We also blame the victim a lot. I'll be working on that as well. You also can have persistent negative emotional states such as fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. Those are the worst of all symptoms because these are the ones people usually relive. Survivor guilt is just absolutely horrible. You can have a diminished interest in participation of significant activities. Things you used to enjoy, you don't enjoy anymore. You just feel detached or estranged from others, just like you're kind of numb. You have persistent inability to experience positive emotions. Your inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. These are really tough symptoms of PTSD. Also, there's another set of symptoms that are related to each other as well. You might have arousal or reactivity associated with traumatic events beginning or worsening after the event. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember, it's like past. They should call it past traumatic stress disorder, and people might get it better. And they would understand that, again, time does not heal all wounds. It can make it worse if there's not processed properly. So you can have irritable behavior or angry outbursts with little or no provocation, usually verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects. People with PTSD will just throw things and get really upset. You can have reckless or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, an exaggerated startle response, meaning if you hear a loud noise, you jump. Now, a lot of us do that, but someone with PTSD will absolutely have it. Also, they don't like to be tapped from behind. Like, don't sneak up behind someone if you think they might have post-traumatic stress disorder and go boo. They don't like it. They don't like surprises like that. They also may have trouble with concentrating, problems with concentrating. And sleep disturbance is often associated with PTSD. And these symptoms have to last more than a month. And there has to be, you really do need a professional to find out if you have PTSD. Again, I'm just reading from the manual of what PTSD is in the clinical terms so people understand it a little better instead of just reading pop psychology. Now, it also can come with dissociative symptoms. And these these symptoms are very distressing because one of them is depersonalization. And depersonalization is a persistent or recurring experience of feeling detached from, as if one were the outside observer of their own mental processes or body, like feeling they're in a dream, feeling a sense of unreality in their self or body, or time moving slowly. I have a lot of people explain this to me as like I'm watching myself in a movie, but I'm I can see myself, but I don't feel myself. They don't feel real, which brings us to the symptom of derealization. They have persistent or recurrent experiences of unreality of surroundings. The world might not look real to them. They might feel like they're in a dreamlike state, distant or distorted. And these can't be attributed to any substance abuse because that happens with the same thing. Now, it can have delayed expression. That post-traumatic stress disorder can occur much, much, much later in life, much later. And also, one of the things that's not in the diagnostic manual, but it is in many clinical discussions that we have and in clinical journals, that they have a sense of a foreshortened future. You'll hear people, especially people who were uh, traumatized as children. They'll go, I'll never make it to 20. I'll never make it to 30. I'll never make it to 40. I'll never make it to 50 or 60. And they just feel the world is unsafe. I have a quick question I ask sometimes to people is if they would go to a movie theater alone, where would they sit? So people with PTSD, and it doesn't mean you have it if you answer either one of these. It's just a quick question I can ask to help me go down these lists of symptoms is that if somebody went to a movie theater alone, where would they sit? And most of the time they will say in the back row in the corner, they can look down and see the world, or the door. So people with PTSD tend to like to be able to get out and not feel trapped. They also like to be where they can see everyone and everything. This is why they enjoy not being in loud crowds. They do not like being around loud situations, fireworks, especially people in combat. So hopefully that helped you understand what it is, and we'll work through these symptoms in future videos. You know what it is, and if you have any of these symptoms, we'll work through what to do about it. Thank you.